Hey guys, tonight we begin with a tale of wild medieval times, as true as can be. Before we plunge headfirst into tonight's tale, take a moment to do the noble thing. Smash that like button, subscribe, not to the Pope, he's got enough followers. And do tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what ungodly hour is it? This channel is blessed by you listening when you subscribe, like, and share this video. We would like to continue with more exciting tales of true facts and history, all for your enjoyment and dozing off. Now hush, dim the lights, and let's begin. Good evening, weary traveler. Kick off your boots, if they aren't too crusted with cow dung, and nestle into your blanket of choice. Tonight's story will neither soothe nor seduce. It will horrify, titillate, and possibly ruin your romantic notions forever. Welcome to Medieval Sex, a horrifyingly honest bedtime story, a love song sung off-key, in a plague ward during Lent. Let's start with this. If you're picturing medieval intimacy as a candlelit affair beneath velvet sheets, accompanied by the gentle strum of a lute, you've been lied to. Repeatedly, viciously. The real medieval bedroom, if it could be called that, was a shared, stinking space where privacy was as fictional as dental hygiene, and romance was more of a livestock exchange than an affair of the heart. There was no foreplay, just forewarnings. Chapter 2. The setting, a stink shared by all. Picture this, a one-room hovel. Walls weeping with condensation, roof letting in the rain like an open invitation from God. One bed, if you're lucky. Straw mattress, if you're really lucky. And that straw has been pissed on by at least 3 different species, one of them probably human. You don't sleep alone. No, your wife is there. So is your mother. Your 2 children, a pig, and possibly your neighbor, passed out after a cider bender. And now, at the darkest hour, you and your spouse try to get amorous. But you must be quiet. Grandmother is snoring on the other side of the room. The pig is watching, and your baby is suckling loudly on a rag soaked in ale to keep it calm. That's your aphrodisiac. Chapter 3. The church, the shame, and the calendar of chastity. Now imagine trying to navigate intimacy when half the year is off limits. The church had opinions. Oh, did they ever? Sundays? Absolutely not. Wednesdays? Suspicious. Fridays? That's Jesus' pain day. Saturdays? Maybe, but not after dark. Add in Lent. Add Advent. Add St. What's-his-face day. Your sex life becomes a Gregorian nightmare. And even when you were allowed, you were expected to approach your spouse with all the passion of a tax accountant. No pleasure, no noise, no joy. Clergymen wrote manuals, not sexy ones, detailing the acceptable mechanics. Missionary only. Lights out. Think about the suffering of Christ. Maybe whisper a psalm. That was the church-approved kink. Confessors, bless their prying souls, would ask about it. Did you take too much pleasure in your marital duty? And if you answered, yes, congratulations. That's a sin. Time for 10 Hail Marys and a healthy portion of shame. Chapter 4. The noble bedchamber. Not much better, just bigger. Ah, but surely the nobles were different? No, they just sinned in silk. Even in castles, privacy was a myth. Servants stood in corners, sleeping or watching, or both. Marriages were arranged at 14, consummated at 14, and a half, and performed like legal ceremonies with grunting. Some lords recorded their sexual relations in journals, not for love, but for inheritance purposes. And if the lady died in childbirth, which she often did, it was back to the marriage market with her corpse barely cold. Royal mistresses were often bathed before visits, but not for hygiene, just to make sure the lice were only crawling in socially acceptable areas. Would you like me to continue directly into Chapter 5, Medieval Birth Control, or How to Not Make Another Mouth to Feed? This script will build in layers of filth, humor, and cultural context until it fills a full 3 hours of grotesque, honest, comedic narration. Chapter 5, Medieval Birth Control, or How to Not Make Another Mouth to Feed. Also known as, Dear God, Please No Twins. In the medieval world, pregnancy wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a death sentence in disguise. Every time you rolled in the hay, sometimes literally, you were gambling with your life, your crops, and your already overcrowded straw mattress. A new mouth to feed meant less bread, fewer turnips, and a higher chance of dying of exhaustion while milking your own cow during labor. So naturally, people got creative. Very creative. Hysterically creative. Let's begin with the basic truth. The church hated birth control. Not disliked. Hated. With a fiery, hellfire-scented passion. Contraception, they said, was a sin. Because why would you not want to make more souls for God to judge? Every act of intimacy was supposed to come with a risk of divine multiplication. But people, being people, didn't always agree. So they turned to folklore, herbs, superstition, and some truly questionable devices that we would now classify as certified nightmare fuel. We're at the Home Herbalist Guide to Not Getting Knocked Up. Medieval women often relied on herbal concoctions passed down from grandmother to mother, and then whispered among gossiping midwives in the marketplace. Want to avoid pregnancy? Try Queen Anne's lace. Chew the seeds, cross your legs, and hope God isn't watching. Or how about rue, also known as the herb of grace? Lovely name, except it was also mildly toxic and might cause seizures. More adventurous women inserted a pessary made of wool soaked in vinegar, onion juice, or, brace yourself, crocodile dung. Mercifully, Europe lacked crocodiles, so that one mostly stayed in Egyptian lore. But still, the concept got around. Where logic failed, imagination soared. Oh, and if that didn't work, just tie a weasel's testicle to your thigh during intercourse. No, really, that was an actual remedy. Or wear an amulet containing a bat's wing, a shard of blessed wood, and a prayer scribbled backward. Because nothing says contraception like witchcraft and rodent parts. Drop of blood abortifacients. Dangerous, desperate, and often deadly. For those already with child, who couldn't afford another screaming bundle of joy, or couldn't risk another deadly childbirth, the options were worse. Abortifacients were herbal mixes designed to expel a fetus, and they often worked by poisoning the mother just enough to end the pregnancy, without quite killing her. Usually, these included pennyroyal, juniper berries, and savory, administered in wine or goat milk, sometimes combined with beatings, hot baths, or hanging upside down from rafters. That last one at least made for an exciting Tuesday. Some of these concoctions came from ancient Roman recipes, passed down in secret, kept alive by women, midwives, and witches, who were often all three, depending on who was accusing you that week. But make no mistake, these were high-risk, last-resort solutions. Often, the cure worked just as well on your kidneys, liver, and pulse. Church condoms? Sort of, but you'd rather not. Condoms, in theory, existed, but the reality was unpleasant. Some sources suggest that animal intestines were fashioned into protective sheaths, tied with ribbon. Romantic, right? Just picture Sir Godfrey fumbling with a sheep's bladder by candlelight while a serving girl pretends not to notice from her cot. They weren't used for contraception as much as to avoid syphilis, which was quickly becoming the medieval plague's cooler, sexier cousin. Still, most commoners couldn't afford such contraptions, so they stuck with hope, herbal voodoo, and prayer. Celibacy, the most effective and least popular option. Of course, the church had a perfect solution. Just don't do it. At all. Ever. Unless married. And even then, only on approved days. And never for fun. And if you enjoyed it, go confess. And fast. Celibacy was promoted especially to clergy, monks, and nuns. But, as you might have guessed, many of them did it anyway. Monasteries were not immune to scandal. Nuns occasionally gave birth. Monks were found in haylofts. A few religious texts were smuggled with illustrations that, well, would raise eyebrows in a modern HR department. Even among peasants, abstinence was considered unnatural. You could try it, but without a calendar, a priest's permission, and a locked chastity belt, also a myth, mostly, odds were someone would cave eventually. And with no TikTok to distract you, what else was there to do after sundown? Woozy face if all else fails. Just deny it. Should you find yourself, say, mysteriously plump in the middle of Lent and unmarried, you could always try denial. Claim immaculate conception. Say you were possessed. Blame elves. Some claimed a demon sat on their chest. Others insisted a spirit entered through the window. If all else failed, blame the weather. Or a passing night. Or both. Of course, these excuses worked best if you were wealthy, male, or fluent in Latin. If you were a poor girl, well, good luck. Hope you float during your trial by water. Chapter 6: Marriage, Meat, and Misery. The bedside politics of medieval matrimony. Forget romance. Forget poetry. Forget long walks in the moonlight. Unless you count trudging through pig dung to ask a neighbor for turnips. In the Middle Ages, marriage was less about happily ever after and more about, dear God, let this alliance stop the goats from being stolen again. Marriage was politics. It was property. It was war insurance with shared bed space. And if you were lucky, you might even find someone who only snored a little and didn't have a fungal foot rot that could knock out a bishop at 50 paces. Love is a cow-shaped contract. Among peasants, marriage wasn't sanctified by doves or string quartets. It was sealed in pig fat and dirt. You wanted to marry the neighbor's daughter? Great. Got a goat. Got 3 turnips and a shovel. Boom. Engagement. Romance wasn't required, and honestly wasn't expected. What mattered was land, livestock, labor, and who had the least problematic relatives. A man's value was in his oxen, his tools, and whether or not he was known to scream at bread. A woman's worth, her ability to survive childbirth and not start a feud over who stole whose bucket. These were not love matches. They were survival pacts. Even noble marriages were little more than blood-soaked game theory. Kings married queens for land. Dukes married duchesses to avoid war. And nobody asked the bride if she was into it. The consent loophole, aka say yes loud enough for the witnesses. The church claimed that consent was required. Sounds nice, doesn't it? But in practice, consent often meant the girl was present and not actively screaming. You could be 12. You could be 9. You could be holding a doll. If your father said yes, and the groom had decent teeth, or at least most of them, that was good enough for the priest. Marriages could be made binding with a single promise, spoken anywhere, anytime. Say in a barn, married. Say it under a tree while drunk on cider, married. Whisper it while pretending to dance, still married. In fact, so many secret marriages happened that the church started demanding witnesses just to keep track. Even then, people kept getting accidentally wed, often while trying to get someone into bed. Oh no, I just said the sacred phrase. Guess we're married now. Better consummate it. Consummation. Let's get miserable. So, the wedding is done. The dowry has been exchanged. The pigs have been blessed. Now comes the consummation. This isn't private. Oh no, that would be modern and respectful. In many noble households, wedding night consummation was a public ritual. Yes, witnesses, sometimes the whole village. The couple would be escorted to the bed, tucked in by their families, and left with a priest or servant standing nearby to verify that the act had occurred. One noble record even describes a bishop standing at the foot of the bed, muttering prayers as the couple did the deed. Imagine trying to focus while a clergyman mutters about damnation. Among peasants, things were less formal, but just as awkward. If you shared a house with your parents, siblings, goats, and perhaps a curious duck, there was no privacy. You waited until everyone was asleep, turned toward the wall, and hoped for silence. Marriage and meat, a brief but juicy interlude. Marriage wasn't all bad. Sometimes it came with perks. Meat, for instance. Most peasants rarely saw meat outside feast days or funerals. But a wedding might mean a slaughtered pig or a chunk of beef, if your dowry was impressive and your relatives didn't eat it first. Roasted chickens, wild herbs, and coarse bread were washed down with ale thick enough to chew, and the whole thing would devolve into a drunken dance where someone inevitably vomited into the well. Love was in the air, and so was dysentery. Marriage is forever, and by forever, we mean until infection wins. Once married, you were stuck. Divorce, not really a thing. Annulments existed, but required a bishop's blessing and usually involved proving you were secretly related, hadn't consummated, or were possessed by Satan during the ceremony. You could separate, sure, but you'd still be married in God's eyes, and God didn't do paperwork. Many marriages were functional but cold. Some were warm, occasionally even loving. But many were battlefields of passive aggression, sexual frustration, and trying not to stab each other with a cooking ladle. Wives often bore children yearly until they died. Husbands drank heavily and hoped the baby had their nose. Affairs were common, though dangerous. Get caught, and you might lose your ears, your land, or worse, be forced to do penance in public with no trousers on. Sleeping with the enemy. Did we mention sleeping arrangements? Beds were rare and shared. A married couple might sleep beside children, servants, or hired farmhands. The straw mattress crawled with lice, bedbugs, and whatever wandered in from the barn. Want a little romance? Good luck. The chickens watching. Again, among nobles, things were marginally better. Feather beds, curtains, servants who at least pretended not to listen. But privacy was never guaranteed. Courtiers gossiped. Servants blabbed. Priests in confession knew everything. And if one partner grew too annoying, you couldn't just walk away. Murder was a common solution. Poison was subtle. Knives were fast. Accidents were arranged. Love, in the medieval sense, often ended with a shallow grave behind the pigsty. Chapter 7. To woo, or not to woo. Courtship rituals, love potions, and very bad poetry. Forget hearts and flowers. Forget whispered sonnets under the moonlight. In the Middle Ages, wooing was a full contact, dirt-covered, emotionally bewildering social obstacle course. Courtship was part negotiation, part social performance, and part holy fear. And if you were lucky, you'd end up with someone who didn't have lice in every crevice and maybe only belched after meals. Let us begin. Love at first stench. Let's set the scene. You're at the market. It's muddy, it smells like pig urine and boiled cabbage, and someone's yelling about carrots being possessed. Across the throng, you spot her, a young woman with hay in her hair and a faint limp from a thatching accident. Her teeth are all mostly present. Your heart races. She's got symmetry. Maybe. It's hard to tell under the grime. But you're smitten. Now what? You can't just walk up and ask her out. That would be wildly inappropriate. No, you must begin the medieval mating ritual. Courting among the peasantry. Flirtation by cow and hoe. Among peasants, courtship began in the fields or village square. It involved demonstrating your economic value. Could you plow straight? Did you own your own ox? Could you chop it without passing out? Sometimes, young men would show off by jumping ditches, lifting barrels, or yelling at livestock in particularly manly ways. If the girl seemed interested and wasn't actively fleeing, you might bring her a gift. Not flowers. Oh no, more practical tokens. A turnip, a comb made from pig bone, or a half-used bar of soap, if you were rich beyond reason. If she accepted the gift without throwing it into a dung heap, you were halfway to marriage. Noble love, courtly, confusing, and mostly performed on horseback. Now, if you were a noble, God help you, courtship became more complex and deeply theatrical. The rules of courtly love demanded elaborate declarations, long silences, secret glances, and poetry so bad it made cows miscarry. Knights would ride into tournaments wearing a lady's sleeve on their helmet, a literal piece of her sleeve tied to their hat as a sign of devotion. If you lost a joust, it meant you loved her too much, and your heart was too heavy to win. Courtly love was often not with your wife, mind you. It was typically directed at a married noblewoman who was supposed to ignore you while you wrote her terrible poetry, comparing her to a wounded swan or a lonely moon. And she, in turn, would pretend to be offended while secretly enjoying the drama, provided it didn't result in war, scandal, or papal intervention. Love potions, guaranteed to cause vomiting or death. Magic and superstition filled in the gaps where charm failed. Love potions were common and horrific. Recipes included crushed beetles, menstrual blood, powdered frog bones, grave dirt, and enough wine to blur judgment. The goal wasn't so much seduction as pharmaceutical coercion. Drink this potion, they said. It'll make you fall in love. More often, it made you hallucinate, evacuate your bowels at speed, or drop dead mid-swoon. But in a world without romantic comedies, this was the next best thing. Some people resorted to amulets, such as dried rabbit testicles or bits of consecrated wafer worn around the neck. Others muttered spells, made dolls, or hid under the beds of their crushes, which somehow wasn't seen as creepy, but charmful. Poetry, the weapon of the weak-willed. Let's talk about the poetry. Medieval love poems were long, confusing, and absolutely awful. They often compared women to things like a white rose covered in dew, meaning she sweats. A falcon held tight by golden reins, meaning She's angry and sharp, a doe lost in the forest of sin, meaning the poet needs to go outside. One particularly ill-advised troubadour compared his love's mouth to a bleeding peach and her voice to a goose weeping in the wind. He was later stoned with radishes. But despite the horror, poetry worked. Because language was currency, and if a man could flatter a woman with words, even rotten ones, he might charm her, or at least confuse her long enough to arrange a betrothal. Courtship games, touching without getting excommunicated. Young people in medieval villages often played ritualized games that skirted the line between innocent fun and full-blown heresy. Games like Who Shall Be My Valentine, in which boys and girls drew names and were married for the day, encouraged to hold hands or exchange tokens. Tag the pig and kiss the tail, exactly as strange as it sounds. Maypole dancing, a sexually suggestive fertility ritual that somehow kept getting greenlit by the church, probably because nobody could figure out what the ribbons actually did. These games allowed touching, flirting, and mild scandal, but if a priest caught you lingering too long, you'd be doing penance faster than a drunk monk at Lent. Flirting among servants and tradesmen. In castles and towns, servants had their own underground courtship cultures. Flirtation happened over laundry lines, chamber pots, and under staircases thick with rat droppings. If a footman liked a scullery maid, he might sneak her a candied almond or a wink from across the spit roast. Sometimes courtship occurred in broom closets, stables, or just behind the kitchens while the nobles argued about soup temperature. Rumors flew fast. If you were seen brushing hands near the butter churn, expect the whole village to know before sundown. If the courtship turned into fornication, you were at best married by force, and at worst flogged publicly while holding a turnip. Flirt, wed, regret. So how did courtship end? With marriage, or a duel, or scandal, sometimes all three. Marriages were often rushed once a couple was caught being too familiar. This could mean anything from dancing too close to being spotted in the woods with a suspicious smile. The church cracked down. Parents made deals. Pregnancies arrived like surprise taxes. Love was rare. Lust was common. Social pressure was constant. And yet, through lice, rot, mud, and God's disapproval, people still fell for one another. Some even stayed together. Others wrote poetry. A few died horribly. And that was courtship. Chapter 8. Wet nurses, widows, and the wild lives of medieval women. If you were a woman in the Middle Ages, your life was likely a mixture of hard labor, childbirth, passive-aggressive religious judgment, and the faint hope of survival. From the cradle to the grave, and often back again if the relic merchants were buying, medieval women moved through a world built to contain, control, and often completely misunderstand them. Yet somehow, many of them thrived, or at the very least, caused incredible trouble. So gather your kerchief, adjust your wimple, and mind the goat droppings. We are stepping into the beautifully brutal world of medieval womanhood. Birth by firelight, from womb to wet nurse. Birth was a dangerous group activity in the Middle Ages, ideally performed in the same room as the cooking fire, a few helpful hens, and at least one woman who claimed to be midwife certified by God. Women gave birth squatting, sitting, or in makeshift birthing chairs with holes cut out. Because what's childbirth without the added horror of poor carpentry? Enter the wet nurse. These were often lower-class women hired by nobles or wealthy merchants to breastfeed and raise their infants, freeing up the noblewoman to return to her other duties, such as dying of plague, embroidering Jesus' beard, or marrying off their 8-year-old. Wet nurses were considered necessary and deeply suspicious. The church worried they might pass on moral flaws through milk, an idea that both overestimated milk and underestimated morality. Still, wet nurses were everywhere. Peasant mothers used them too, sometimes out of necessity, often because they had to return to work the day after birth. Like literally, the next day. Childbirth. Great. Now go milk the goat. Widows. The freest women in the Middle Ages, but also still in hell. Oddly enough, the most powerful, autonomous women in medieval society were often widows, but only after they'd buried a man, lost most of their teeth, and inherited enough land to be considered dangerous. A widow could own property. She could run a business. She could speak her mind in public. And she could say, no, thank you, to marriage proposals without being stoned or lectured by a priest. She had seen death. She had survived childbirth. She was not in the mood. Some widows became guild mistresses, landlords, or village matriarchs feared by children and priests alike. Others became professional mourners, wailing at funerals so loudly they sometimes caused the dead to shift in protest. Widowhood gave women freedom, but at a cost. Years of servitude, pain, and often having to deal with the property disputes of 12 illegitimate stepchildren and a cousin who insists he deserves the chicken coop. Working women, beer, bread, and bleeding fingers. Forget the stereotype of the docile damsel weaving tapestries and waiting for a knight. Most medieval women were too busy keeping the entire economy from collapsing. They brewed ale, hence the term alewife. They spun wool, they made cheese, they tended animals, baked bread, ran markets, raised children, mended shoes, and, if lucky, managed not to bleed out in the process. Women's work was often unacknowledged because it happened in the home, which in medieval terms meant a smoky hut shared with 6 people and a donkey named Bernard. They stitched, soaked, salted, and scraped until their hands were calloused and their backs shaped like question marks. They were midwives, washerwomen, herbalists, and, occasionally, heretics when their healing got a little too effective for the church's liking. Religion and the women who didn't fit. For women who didn't want marriage, childbirth, or dealing with Geoffrey the pig farmer, there was another path: religion. Nunneries offered relative safety, food, literacy, and the chance to yell at people for picking flowers during Lent. A lucky few became abbesses, who could own land, wield power, and terrify bishops with passive-aggressive Latin letters. But religious life wasn't all Gregorian chants and calm meditation. Nuns still faced the same dangers: sickness, political interference, and the occasional Viking raid. Some convents were so wild with intrigue that they were closer to soap operas than sanctuaries, featuring forbidden romances, political espionage, and petty vengeance via chicken theft. Then there were the mystics, women like Hildegard of Bingen, who claimed visions from God and became best-selling authors of their age. Granted, these visions often included floating eyeballs and screaming suns, but they gave women a voice in a world that usually preferred them quiet and preferably invisible. Witches, whores, and why you're probably one or the other. Medieval women walked a razor's edge. Too outspoken, you were a witch. Too attractive, temptress. Too independent, suspicious. Too poor, lazy. Too rich, must be sleeping with the devil. Even being helpful could backfire. Helped a neighbor's baby recover with herbs? You were clearly in league with Satan. Read a book? Burn her. Refused a marriage proposal from a 52-year-old man who smelled like pickled sheep? Definitely cursed. The line between wise woman and which was paper-thin and deeply sexist. Many women were burned or drowned simply for existing at the wrong time, in the wrong place with the wrong mole on their face. And prostitutes? Often condemned, sometimes tolerated, occasionally regulated, but always blamed for everything from bad crops to erectile dysfunction. Yet many worked under city licenses, lived in brothel quarters, and had their own secretive power in the community. So long as the church needed a scapegoat, they were available. Love, motherhood, and misery, and still they laughed. Despite everything, war, childbirth, famine, plague, dumb husbands, the constant threat of being excommunicated for sneezing on a feast day, women carved out lives full of humor, joy, resilience, and yes, the occasional rebellion. They sang. They told stories. They invented lullabies and gossip, and entire genres of dirty jokes about bishops. They raised children, buried lovers, and occasionally started revolts when the taxes got stupid. The medieval world tried to crush them, contain them, or control them. But women, they survived. And sometimes, just sometimes, they thrived. Chapter 9. The Confessor's Chair. How the Church invented guilt and then wrote it down in Latin. If medieval life was a grimy stage production of suffering and obedience, then the confessional was its backstage trapdoor, a place where peasants, nobles, whores, and widows alike whispered their sins to a man in robes who smelled like old incense and passive aggression. Confession wasn't just a sacrament. It was a medieval surveillance system wrapped in theology designed to turn every unwashed soul into its own prison warden. The church had discovered something more powerful than swords, kings, or gold. Guilt. Chronic, generational, soul-crushing guilt. And dear listener, they packaged it in Latin so no one could argue back. The origins, from public penance to personal shame spiral. In the early centuries of Christianity, if you sinned, you confessed publicly, as in, stand in front of the entire village, admit you stole Brother Osric's chicken, and spend the next 3 months eating ashes and being pelted with leeks. But by the 7th century, Irish monks, the true masterminds of psychological discomfort, introduced private confession. The idea, you could whisper your sin to a priest in secret, and then he could whisper it to God, or write it down in a giant handbook of doom. This gave birth to the penitentials, thick volumes listing every sin imaginable, from murder to thinking slightly lustful thoughts about a passing goose. Each sin came with a penalty. Stole a loaf of bread, 3 days of fasting on barley water, masturbated during Lent, 40 days on bread and water, no salt, had sex standing up. That's double penance, because gravity. The church, in effect, created a menu of sin, and everyone was forced to order from it. Open book the Latin trap. Say it, don't understand it. The confessional may have been whispered in the vernacular, but everything that mattered, doctrine, records, absolution, was written down in Latin, a language almost no one outside the clergy could read. This meant that your soul's eternal fate was mediated by a man who could translate both your misdeeds and his own mood swings into ecclesiastical judgment. Did I say 7 Hail Marys? I meant 70. Did I say bread and water? I meant cold eel and a night sleeping in the pig trough. Who would question him? You? The illiterate pig shepherd who thinks St. Paul and St. Peter were roommates? The Latin barrier made guilt unknowable, infinite, and utterly clerical. You could feel it. You just couldn't name it. Couch and lamp. Confession as emotional torture theater. The confessional booth, or chair, or corner was not a place of comfort. It was a low-stakes interrogation room, with Christ as the silent witness and a priest trained in moral micromanagement. Questions could include, have you entertained unclean thoughts while milking your cow? Have you taken delight in another's injury during the harvest? Did you laugh during the sermon about eternal damnation? The goal was not merely to confess, but to crawl, weep, and debase yourself into spiritual mulch. The ideal penitent was ashamed, terrified, and willing to hand over livestock in exchange for forgiveness. This led to repeat business. Sinners kept coming back, not just because they sinned again, they did, constantly, but because they were never sure they'd done it right the first time. Fire inventing new sins, because medieval life was too easy. Confession was too important to be left to actual behavior. The church needed a constant stream of sin, and so it got creative. They began listing sins of thought, of implied intention, of accidental sacrilege, and minor bodily oddities. Dreamed of dancing? Might be demonic. Laughed during Mass? Clearly possessed. Sneezed during a relic procession? You insulted the saints. Ate meat on Friday by mistake. A soul-threatening disaster. And don't even think about touching yourself. The church had a 10,000-word thesaurus of horror reserved for that crime alone. The penalty? Fasting, public confession, or, if you did it while dreaming, sleeping in a ditch with cold water thrown on you. Confession became a trap with no floor. There was always another layer of guilt beneath the one you just uncovered. Money bag indulgences, guilt monetized. Eventually, someone clever in a bishop's chair thought, what if people could pay their way out of all this discomfort? Enter the indulgence, the medieval equivalent of spiritual punch card. For a small fee, or a large one, you could shorten your time in purgatory, which had become the church's spiritual DMV. Long, boring, and staffed by vengeful angels. Indulgences were sold in churches, markets, and even taverns, complete with preachers shouting about hellfire and flyers advertising 2-4-1 absolution days. A few coins here, a relic kiss there, and you were clean again, until your next impure thought about Sister Agnes and her suspiciously well-fitted habit. Shushing face, priestly secrets, or what he did with your confession. To be fair, the priest wasn't allowed to tell anyone what you said in confession. This was called the seal of the confessional, and breaking it was a sin so serious It could get you excommunicated faster than farting during communion. But that didn't stop him from remembering. Nor did it stop certain priests from asking deeply invasive questions about your sex life, dietary sins, and goat-related mishaps under the guise of spiritual care. Also, if you were a woman, expect to be grilled. Women's confessions were seen as riskier, more prone to temptation, and more likely to be heard with one hand on a punishment book and the other holding a handkerchief to the nose. Smiling face with halo guilt as a lifestyle. By the high Middle Ages, guilt wasn't just a feeling, it was an identity. Good Christians were expected to confess frequently, flagellate regularly, and constantly monitor their hearts for signs of rebellion, lust, or slightly enjoying life. The best Christians were miserable. The worst? Unaware that their happiness might be a mortal sin. So they confessed, again and again, until their sins were ground into chalk dust, their souls weighed like barley, and their penances filled notebooks stored in some monk's damp scriptorium. Skull and crossbones, and, at the hour of death, in the end, all roads led back to the confessor. As you lay dying, surrounded by chickens, grieving relatives, and that one cousin already eyeing your boots, you would whisper your final sins to the priest. And if he wasn't there, you might go to hell for dying in transit. So you kept a priest on retainer, just in case your soul made an unscheduled departure. Because guilt, dear listener, was medieval glue. It bound the people to the church, the peasant to the priest, and the entire rotting edifice of feudal Europe to the idea that forgiveness could be bought, but only after you'd wept a little. Kissmark Chapter 10. Carnal Catastrophes. Forbidden love, incest, and the dangerous game of bed-hopping. In the holy tug-of-war between passion and piety, the medieval world somehow managed to fall face-first into a dung heap of both. Desire was everywhere, rules were abundant, and nearly everyone broke them, often in places where the goats could see. It was a time when a misplaced kiss could cause a war, and a shared glance might need papal dispensation. When forbidden love wasn't just a tragic theme in songs. It was a full-time hazard of living in a village with only 4 surnames. Fire the forbidden fruit was usually your cousin. Let's begin with the great taboo of the age. Incest. Not the Game of Thrones kind, though sometimes alarmingly close, but the real, Catholic-defined version, which included anyone up to the 7th degree of consanguinity. In plain English, that's your cousins, second cousins, third cousins, the guy your cousin married, the neighbor who once borrowed your uncle's plow. The church's incest rules were so ridiculously expansive, you could accidentally marry a relative and not find out until a monk with a chart of ancestors informed you mid-ceremony. But here's the medieval joke. Everyone was related, especially in small villages, especially in noble courts, especially in Europe, where the aristocracy was basically one big, passive-aggressive family reunion, which meant everyone was guilty, or at least potentially sinful, which was perfect for the church, because it meant they got to sell you an exemption. Yes, you could apply for a dispensation, a fancy Latin letter from the Pope that said, "Go ahead, marry your cousin. Just tithe a bit more. Bed affairs of the flesh, and farmhouse." Let's not kid ourselves. Medieval people had sex. Frequently. Furiously. Often with the wrong person. Adultery was rampant, especially among the nobility, whose marriages were arranged for land, not lust. If you were a countess stuck with a husband who smelled like salted pork in ambition, you might seek comfort in a handsome squire with good calves and fewer titles. These affairs weren't just risky, they were legal nightmares. Adultery could lead to public shaming, forced pilgrimage, nose removal in some parts of Germany, execution if your spouse was a petty monarch with poor impulse control, but enforcement was laughably inconsistent. A nobleman's indiscretions were winked at. A peasant woman caught sneaking behind the haystack, dragged through the streets holding a pig's tail and wearing a shame hood. Even priests weren't immune. Monks took vows of celibacy, but plenty broke them behind cloisters, stables, or while allegedly teaching Latin. Some monasteries became less about divine contemplation, more about who was sneaking into whose cell after Compline. Heart with their courtly love, romance with a side of heresy. Meanwhile, over in the castles of poetry and perfumed parchment, the concept of courtly love blossomed like a very doomed flower. It was an idealized form of romance that encouraged emotional passion between a knight and a lady who was absolutely not his wife. The rules were bizarre. You must love hopelessly. You must write awful poetry. You must pine theatrically while wearing tight hose. This wasn't just tolerated. It was celebrated in songs, stories, and awkward banquets where everyone pretended not to notice Sir Baldwin blushing at Lady Cressida during the toast. The church despised courtly love. It glorified lust, mocked marriage, and encouraged a level of romantic angst typically found in 14-year-olds and troubadours. Sexuality as a sinful side effect. The female body was not just feared, it was blamed. If a man had lustful thoughts, it was because a woman's body tempted him. If a monk broke his vows, it was because a woman seduced him. If a goat died in the field, and the crops failed, and your teeth fell out, it was probably your neighbor's wife and the curve of her ankle. And so, every female body became a potential crime scene. This led to bizarre rules. Pregnant women were expected to confess for having enjoyed the act that got them pregnant. Women who gave birth to girls were sometimes seen as less virtuous than those who bore sons. A woman who died in childbirth was called a martyr of Eve's curse, a theological way of saying oops. Dying in childbirth, and other ways the church took credit for your pain. Perhaps the most obscene irony of all was how the church took credit for maternal suffering. Dying in childbirth. That was God's will. Cramps, a divine reminder. Tearing during delivery, because your village didn't believe in forceps yet? A sacred burden. Women were told to offer their pain to Christ, to bear their agony as a holy penance, because pain, after all, was purifying, and no one needed purifying more than the creature who tempted Adam, danced with Satan, and occasionally read herbal manuscripts without permission. Persenealing and the virgin/whore prison. In the end, all medieval women were stuffed into a 2-bedroom prison built by theology. The virgin, who was pure, holy, inaccessible, and preferably dead. The whore, who was sinful, seductive, and responsible for every ecclesiastical nosebleed from Canterbury to Cologne. There was no middle ground. Just pain, piety, and shame, all supervised by men in cassocks writing angry Latin footnotes about uterine behavior. Church, Chapter 13. Cloistered carnality. Nuns, monks, and the secret lives of the supposedly celibate. Behind stone walls, under vows of silence and chastity, in a life supposedly devoted to prayer, poverty, and piety, the monastic world festered with forbidden flesh, whispered confessions, and creative disobedience. The monks and nuns of medieval Europe weren't just scribbling holy texts and tending beads. They were quite often bonking behind the altar, composing horny poetry, hoarding cheese, and engaging in acts so unholy even the devil blushed. Let's be clear, celibacy was the rule, but in practice, it was a polite suggestion. Persenealing monks, supposedly celibate, secretly salacious. The male monastery was a fortress of rules. No meat, no possessions, no women, and absolutely no funny business with Brother Thomas in the scriptorium. Naturally, monks broke every one of these. Monks were caught, spying on each other bathing, strictly for spiritual assessment, of course. Seducing novices with psalms and pantry wine. Sneaking out at night to meet lovers. Or, in some cases, each other. In one infamous 13th century case, a monk was discovered with a collection of erotic drawings, a secret passage to the nearby nunnery, and a pet ferret named Lucifer. Okay, the name may be apocryphal, but the sin wasn't. Some monks confessed to lustful dreams about the Virgin Mary, which the church did not find flattering. Others tried to self-flagellate the desire away, but then started enjoying that too much. One chronicler even noted a monk who tried to purify his thoughts by sitting in freezing water while reciting erotic poetry in Latin, which sounds less like penance and more like performance art. Woman with headscarf nuns, brides of Christ with a secret key to the pantry. If monks were bad, nuns were often worse, mainly because nobody expected them to be. Nunneries were supposed to be pure sanctuaries, places where women escaped the corruption of the flesh and the leering of men. But many nunneries became hotbeds of lust, laughter, and illicit cheesemaking. Records survive of pregnant nuns being transferred in secret, or made to wear loose robes and pray more loudly, to drown suspicion. Illicit letters being passed through grates by choir boys, stable boys, or sometimes disguised monks. Entire convents getting drunk off communion wine and putting on midnight dances to the scandal of nearby bishops. The church occasionally tried to intervene, sending inspectors or demanding confessions, but the women would often lock the doors, hide the wine, and start singing hymns. What could the bishop do? He wasn't allowed inside. One 14th century bishop reported that a nunnery in the Low Countries had turned into a brothel of psalms and scandal. He was not invited back. Bed, holy flesh and unholy beds, forbidden love stories. Despite the walls, locks, and vows, forbidden love bloomed among the cloistered. The most infamous case? Probably Heloise and Abelard, the 12th century philosopher and his star pupil, who fell into a romance so explosive, Abelard was literally castrated by her angry relatives. Their letters, however, remain some of the most erotically intellectual documents of the Middle Ages. Heloise confessed to still fantasizing about their nights together, even while at prayer. Abelard, a monk now, begged her to forget, but not too much. The letters read like a medieval mix of Romeo and Juliet and 50 Shades of Cloister Gray. And theirs wasn't an isolated story. Other monks and nuns carved each other's names into chapel walls, buried locks of hair in reliquaries, invented holy embraces as an excuse for laying on hands and hips. These weren't just carnal escapades. These were people starved of touch, affection, and identity, whose only outlet was a system that told them their bodies were sins wrapped in skin. Mitombo and gluttony, greed, and cloister corruption. Let's not forget, monasteries weren't just spiritual homes. They were massive landholders, lavish dining halls, and storerooms of forbidden delights. Benedictine monks were technically only allowed one meal a day, but somehow they managed to invent triple cheese stews, brew strong beer in the name of Jesus, roast entire pigs, and serve them with guilt and gravy. When chastity slipped, gluttony slithered in behind it. Some monks grew so fat they couldn't kneel. Others invented fasting loopholes, declaring that anything boiled in wine didn't count as food. Meanwhile, nuns hoarded spices, secret wine cellars, and racy romances hidden in hollowed-out hymnals. One inspection found a nun's private quarters lined with tapestries of Saint Sebastian, in suspiciously suggestive poses. Yes, even saints had groupies. Punishment and cover UPS. Of course, not everyone got away with it. Monks caught in sexual sin could be beaten, imprisoned in tiny stone cells, transferred to remote, plague-prone outposts, made to dig latrines as divine penance. Nuns might be publicly shamed, excommunicated, locked in their cells, or quietly shipped off to a stricter convent in the Alps, never to be heard from again. But most often, the church covered things up. Monastic houses were rich, politically protected, and full of useful secrets. The church wasn't eager to air its holy laundry, or the stains upon it. Flesh and faith, a constant struggle. In the end, the monasteries and nunneries of medieval Europe were paradoxes of passion and repression. Places meant to transcend the body, yet constantly tangled in it. Shelters from temptation that became greenhouses of it. They were not failures. They were human. Gloriously, tragically, human. And their secret lives reveal not just sin, but longing. For love. For connection. For a God who might understand what it's like to be stuck in a body with a pulse and a prayer and absolutely no privacy. Chapter 14. The Pilgrim's Peril. Sin, sodomy, and surprises on the road to Rome. Pilgrimage. That sacred journey to atone for your sins, seek miracles, visit relics, or escape the consequences of sleeping with your neighbor's spouse. The roads to Rome, Santiago de Compostela, and Canterbury were crawling with spiritual seekers. And by seekers, we mean pickpockets, fornicators, professional liars, amateur saints, wandering whores, and clergymen with very portable guilt. Officially, the Pilgrim's Path was a moral gauntlet toward spiritual enlightenment. Unofficially, it was a medieval mashup of Spring Break, the Canterbury Tales, and a penitential version of Fire Festival, but with more venereal disease and fewer tents. Let's begin. Luggage. "I'm going on pilgrimage," said every person about to misbehave. To the church, pilgrimage was a noble act, a walking confession, a way to literally leave your sins behind by foot, mile after mile, blister after blister, until you'd sweated out your shame onto the dirt road and traded it for indulgences and holy trinkets. But for many, it was just the only socially acceptable excuse to leave town. Want to skip your debts? Pilgrimage. Caught boinking to Reeves' wife? Off to see St. Thomas? Need a break from the monastery you've been secretly defiling? Rome awaits. People vanish for months, even years, under the sacred umbrella of piety. And while some genuinely sought spiritual healing, many were there for sin in disguise. As one monk put in the 13th century, the road to Rome is paved not with prayers, but with brothels, boots, and bastard children. Elf pilgrim fashion, the medieval sin tourist look. Pilgrims were marked by long cloaks, staffs tipped with symbols of their destination, shells, badges, and fake relics pinned to their garments, and a smell that could blind a mule at 30 paces. They were supposed to look humble and pious. Instead, many wore obscene badges sold outside churches. Naked St. James's, penis-shaped bottles of miracle water, and even tiny pewter vulvas with wings, allegedly to help your soul fly faster. One popular token, a relic of St. Mary's breast milk, sold in small flasks that were mostly filled with curdled goat cheese and hope. Motorway, the road was long, and so was the list of sins. Once on the road, pilgrims encountered way stations full of wine, dice, and women who didn't ask too many questions. Other pilgrims with very different definitions of chastity. Clerics who offered forgiveness for coin, but also took payment in kisses, flesh, or favors. In towns where pilgrim discount meant we rob you slower. You might sleep in a church one night and a brothel the next. And in both cases, the bedding would be haunted and the stew would be sentient. Pilgrim bands formed temporary communities, laughing, sinning, praying, and occasionally waking up naked in a ditch clutching a saint's toe bone and a stranger's girdle. And always, there was danger, from thieves, storms, wolves, lepers, bad wine, or monks selling holy ointment that definitely gave you a rash. Eggplant sodomy and spiritual flexibility. Let's not tiptoe around it. Pilgrimage was also a gay old time. Medieval records reveal men bedding men in roadside camps, especially when women were scarce or prohibited. Clergy caught in compromising positions with altar boys or other monks under the stars of penitence. And in one deeply confused case, a woman disguised as a man on pilgrimage for penance fell in love with a man disguised as a woman on pilgrimage for fun, and both were arrested by a bishop for heresy of the loins. Sodomy was a sin. So was lust. But on the road, identities blurred. People shared beds for warmth, kissed as brothers in Christ, and conveniently forgot the rules between shrines. The church, of course, reacted with horror by imposing fines, torture, and vague sermons about fire and worms. But that didn't stop the pilgrims from pressing flesh in the name of Saint Whoever. Smiling face with halo miracles, madness, and made-up relics. To make the pilgrimage worth it, you had to come home with a miracle or at least a good story. People claimed to have seen Mary in a cabbage field, to have wept blood at the tomb of St. Cuthbert after eating suspicious mushrooms, to have been healed of impotence, only to relapse 3 weeks later and try again. In the relic market, absolutely deranged. For a few coins you could buy Jesus' foreskin. There were at least 14 in circulation. Feathers from the Holy Spirit. Milk from the Virgin Mary. Yes, again, the thigh bone of St. George's horse, and multiple nails from the true cross. So many, in fact, that Christ would have been crucified on a metal cube. Place of worship the return. Confessions, diseases, and souvenirs. When pilgrims returned home, they were greeted as heroes, or infected sinners, depending on what they brought back. Some brought relics. Others brought syphilis. Some claimed divine enlightenment. Others came back pregnant, married to someone they couldn't remember, or missing a toe but swearing they saw God in a thunderstorm behind a latrine. And the confessions that followed. Oh, the poor priests. They had to listen to. I fornicated thrice, but in a tent, so perhaps that doesn't count. I sold fake indulgences to a nun. I kissed a statue. With tongue. Police Scarlight final thought. Pilgrimage, or medieval spiritual tourism. In the end, pilgrimage was a paradox. A genuine act of faith. A chance for transformation. A rolling carnival of grime, grace, and gonorrhea. It allowed sinners to feel saved, and saints to feel sin. It blurred the lines between piety and pleasure, between repentance and relapse. And that, perhaps, was its truest miracle. That so many people, walking with guilt in their hearts and mud on their boots, found something, anything, worth believing in. Even if that something was a dried toenail in a velvet pouch labeled Jesus.